Great morning to everyone that's out there. It is Wednesday, and this is your Wednesday morning edition of Morning Manna. Let's get in here. Ooh. We sing our song in the sanctuary. Sorry for being a little late this morning, but I had to make a transition from the previous to here. See you guys coming in. What's up, Airman? You're the first one in the room. Carla Mathis, great morning. Vivian Rankins, good morning to you as well. As you guys are coming in, man, a little bit later than normal is when I had to make that transition. We had a great prayer time this morning at 7 a.m. And I just can't jump into the next thing sometimes. I had to kind of process. Linda Burt Robinson, Linda Smith, great morning to all of you that are out there. Look who's first in the room today, Airman Harris. Great morning to all of you guys coming in. Amazing, amazing, amazing morning. Stephanie Triggs. We're going to have a great conversation today. I think you guys are going to we'll get into the book of Numbers. Great morning, Annie Babers. So let's get, we're going to give them a couple seconds to get in here. I'm ready to move forward. Man, the prayer was good this morning. All right. All right, so let's get in here on today. We're going to get into this conversation. Whoo, man. Those of you who are a part of our 7 a.m. prayer, wasn't it amazing? It was an amazing piece of God to be with us on today. All right, you guys are coming in. Yes. Yes, Lord, for the rest of my day. All right. Man, it's daylight now. Till the year's going by. All right, so let's get in here. I'm not going to belabor this time any longer. We're going to get into this, and I'm going to silence. I'm going to pull that up so I can see who's coming in with you guys. I have so I want to do that. Let me pull that up as well. All right, so I can see what y'all see. All right, got it. Great morning. Everybody's coming. I can see everybody now. All right, it was indeed 7 a.m. prayer was fire, y'all. Y'all missing it. Y'all need to get in here for 7 a.m. prayer. It was absolutely amazing. God has met us every single morning at 7 a.m. The link is in our great morning to you, Ruth Phelps Rushlow. The link is in our is posted on the page as well. All right, so let's get in here. We're going to begin our conversation. I'm coming here to begin. I'll pull the Bible up on the thing. Fire and desire. I'm not sure what Rick James and Tina Marie got to do with this mother babies. I'm just messing with you. All right, so I'm going to pull up Numbers, but I want to begin talking, and so whoever comes in is going to have to follow us up. Chapter 1, and I would like to read this. We'll attempt. We'll see what. If I read this in the complete Jewish Bible, the CJB, if you guys will be able to follow along, because sometimes we'll try to read this in the CJB. All right, so that's going to be too much. I'm going to read this in the King James Version. That's going to be the closest version to the CJB. So, all right, so we're going to get going in here on today, King James Version. That way it'll make sense. I don't want you guys to get lost. All right, grantastic morning to you as well. Patricia Abilene's gang, Kevin Finley, all of you guys that are out there. Let's get in here. Let's get to this lesson on today. Alma Collier, great morning. Patricia Abilene Gaines, Kevin, I saw you sneaking. There we go. Mother Geraldine Walker born, so we can get started. It's her fault, y'all. She comes in late, then we get started late. All right. But let's get into this lesson on today. So we're talking about the book of, we're talking about the book of, we're starting with the book of Numbers. We completed, and I just want to set this up for you guys so that you have a clear understanding of what's going on. When we look at the book of Numbers, great morning, Emma Donald, Stacy Crosby. Oh, Stacy missed prayer this morning. It was amazing. Emma, I want to see you tomorrow, 7 a.m. Let's be here for prayer for 7 a.m. All right. So when you look at the book of Numbers, and most of you would probably agree that when you think of the book of Numbers, you're thinking that this is, as it would say, the English word, the book of Numbers, is a book of, it's a census, and that's probably what most of us were told. That's what I was told growing up. The book of Numbers is really a census. It was about, counting the people, and it was just a group of censuses. A group of censuses. That sounds funny, but and that does occur in the book of Numbers. And when we think about the book of Numbers, it's probably the one that most of us like. You probably never read the book of Numbers. Have never read the book of Numbers. Didn't spend much time talking about the book of Numbers because it just sounds boring. And who wants to read about some numbers? It's like accounting. It's like, oh, it's time to do taxes. It's not something that most people would want to do. And so when we look at this, I want to help you guys to understand. So I'm going to pull up my notes because I went back and took some notes that I think are going to be helpful, some things that I thought were interesting. And I thought that I had brought them up, but it doesn't look like I did. Let me see if I can find these things. Documents. Let me just do a search. Hold on one second, because this will help your conversation. That's the problem. I put them under Deuteronomy, and we're in the book of Numbers. All right, so here we go. So this is, I don't know why I said Deuteronomy, but I saved it as Deuteronomy, not Numbers. All right, so when we look at the book of Numbers, I must be excited about getting to Deuteronomy. When we look at the book of Numbers, it is not just a listing of censuses. It is not just about, great morning, all of you guys are coming in. Y'all coming right to the meat of things because I've screwed up and I've went to the wrong thing. So I need you all to understand this. We're going to get into this. From the night of the firstborn death, which was the final plague in Egypt, from the night of the firstborn deaths in Egypt to the conclusion of the book of Leviticus that we just finished here. Great morning, everybody. This entire period of time has only been about 1 year. So I need you all to put yourselves in this mind frame to really understand where we're going with the book of Numbers. You need to keep in mind. So from the last plague in Israel, Egypt leaving, and when they left, you got to understand, God showed his power and his sovereignty and his ability to do whatever he wanted to do in his battle and his showdown with the Pharaoh. So when they left Egypt, it was not just the Hebrews that crossed over, but it was everyone. It was, there were Africans, there were people from other nations that saw Jehovah God, Jehovah, and his power and how he came through. And so when they left, they say, hey, we're serving your God. We're going with your God. So they all came out of Egypt together, crossed the Red Sea. Now they're here at Mount Sinai. And this entire process from the firstborn in Egypt to the time that we concluded the book of Leviticus, which we did on yesterday, is only about a year. Okay, so it's important for you to keep that in mind. So you could imagine the type of change that was going on. And you ask yourself, can I really imagine that amount of change, that kind of change, all in a year? They were fully pagans, serving this false gods and the gods of Egypt. You got to think, for 400 years they were in Egypt. So the only thing that they knew, they were probably more Egyptian than they were Hebrew at this point, serving the Hebrew gods. But there was always a remnant. God always has a remnant who have always kept the tenets and the history and those things. You could imagine the United States is just over 200 years old. So can you imagine the period of 400? Many of us don't even know what happened 60 years ago, or can relate to what happened, at the Boston Tea Party and the Civil War and all of these things. So imagine a people that are coming out of a land after 400 years. Much of their identity was tied to who Egypt was. It wasn't like they had these people that were always worshiping God. There was a remnant of people who were historians that kept the history of Israel intact, or the Hebrews intact, and they're coming out mostly with an understanding that they're Egyptians that were separated, and they understood that there was a difference between them and the Egyptians, but their lifestyle, their way of living, the things that they worship were probably more consistent with Egypt than they were the Hebrew people. All right, so it's only been a year. Can you imagine that type of change, going from fully pagan to being fully holy in just 12 months? This is a lot of change happening. Change is happening fast for them. Okay. And so as we begin to look at this and we look at the book of Numbers, it's important to keep in mind that the law was a shadow. It pointed forward. It was, in essence, God was writing in this particular situation the Constitution of Israel. So when we look at the law that God wrote, he wrote the Constitution. What is the Constitution? It talks about how we will govern ourselves, how we will live as a nation, who we are as a people. And so when we look at the law, in many ways, we can look at this as though God is writing the Constitution of Israel before they become a nation. And keeping that principle in mind will help you to understand, because they are yet in the wilderness at Mount Sinai, at the base of Mount Sinai, and they've been living there now for about a year. They've been in this particular place, that when God gives them the book of Leviticus, he completes it there, right? So these laws and these rituals were set forth. Great morning, Janice Staples, Eric Rosa, Machul, all of you that are out there. So these laws and these rituals were set forth as a plan for atoning sin, for holiness, and for purity for God's service. So when we begin to understand these things and put them in their proper context, it will help us to have a greater understanding of the New Testament Bible as we begin to study and to read. All right. So number is just it's really one of the most vibrant, informative books of the Bible. I know you don't read it because you were always thought that it was about censuses. They numbered the people, but it's really one of the most informative, most vibrant books in the Old Testament Bible. And we will see the Messiah, the pre-incarnate. Remember that word, pre-incarnate? Before his becoming a man. Incarnate means fleshly, or deal with before becoming fleshly. We will see the existence of him in the book of Numbers. And Numbers is laid exclusively on the foundation of the books of Genesis and Exodus. So when we begin to see, it's hard for you to come to the book of Numbers and start reading here, because all of the principles, the understanding, and the story or the context of this, the prerequisites would be the book of Genesis and Exodus. So Genesis, Exodus, Numbers. It is laid exclusively on understanding those basic principles that we understand in those books. Okay. And so the law of Moses, or the law of Moshe, we need to understand that it did not redeem Israel. We're going to begin to get into this context, because I want to share with you all some scriptures as we begin to go through this. I want to first of all go to 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter. We're going to read verses 1 through 11, because in 1 Corinthians, Paul reflects back to this particular. So I'm going to pull up 1 Corinthians. I should have had it up already. If I can learn how to spell it. There we go. I'm going to steal that one. We're going to 1 Corinthians. I think I want to go to the 11th chapter. 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 11. That's what we're going to do. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 11. I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to share this on my screen with you all, because Paul talks about the book of Numbers here. So let me share this with you. I'm going to share the screen. All right, here we go. All right, so you guys are going to see my screen now. All right, so when we look at this here, 1 Corinthians, the 10th chapter, and we're looking at this. This is Paul writing this, right? We're going to read verses 1 through 11, and he references the things and the details that are taking place in the book of Numbers. So we look at this. Moreover, my brethren, I would not that ye be ignorant how that all of our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. This is talking about coming through the wilderness, right? And we're all baptized unto Moshe or Moses in the cloud and in the sea. and did all eat of the same spiritual meat, that quail and that manna, and did all drink that same spiritual drink, for they drank of the spiritual rock that followed them, and that rock was Christ. And so he begins to show that even, remember when they were receiving water from the rock, symbolically speaking, that rock was symbolic of the new water that would flow. Remember, we talked about that living water in the book of Leviticus, and that rock was Christ, verse number 5. But with many of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Okay, there were those who died in the wilderness. Now, these things were our examples, to the intent we should not luster after evil things, as they did also lusted. Neither be idolaters, as were some of them, as it was written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up early to play. Verse number 8, neither let us commit fornication, as some of them committed and fell in one day, three and 320,000, 320,000 individuals. All right. Verse number 9, neither let us tempt Christ, as some of them also tempted and were destroyed of the serpents. Neither murmur ye, as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. And then lastly, verse number 11, now all these things happened unto them for examples, and they were written, and they are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. So here we see that Paul is actually beginning to recount and bring into memory to them some of the things that existed. Hey, how you doing, Sandra Coleman? Great seeing you this morning. Everyone, sorry I'm late. Faye, great seeing you, Faye. All right, so when we look at this, we now see that Paul is recounting some of these things, and he's sharing with them some of these things, all right? Although the book of Numbers is a historical book, it is largely historical. I told you it sits on the platform of Genesis and Exodus. It is also a prophetic book, and it talks about a lot that is going to come. And so when we look at the book of Numbers, it is a powerful book, not to be mistaken just for the name that we give it, all right? So the word numbers in Greek is arithmeo. Arithmoel, okay? And that means, that's where we get the term arithmetic, which is where we got the English numbers. But arithmoel is a Greek word, and that is where, when we look at the number, the book Numbers as English, that's where we get that from. And so it's named really Numbers due to the very first chapter, where some of the events, and we'll see that in just a second. All right, so the original Hebrew name, I'm looking at you because I see you guys screaming in over here. The original Hebrew name of Numbers was Bidmar. Let me get this right. The original, because Bamidbar, that's what it is. The original name for Numbers in the Hebrew language was Bamidbar. All right. And what Bamidbar means is actually in the wilderness. So as we understand the book, or we read the book Numbers, that is actually the Greek interpretation of the word, which is arithmoel, which means numbers, like where we get arithmetic. But the actual Hebrew name for the book of Numbers was Bamidbar, and Bamidbar actually means in the wilderness. So this is an account of the Israelites as they crossed over the Red Sea and they spent their time in the wilderness. And the first 10 chapters of Bamidbar, or Numbers, occurred within the first 20 days of their time in the wilderness. So it's important for you to understand this. The first 20 days are recorded for the book of Numbers, all right? And it defines and begins to give an understanding of a separate priesthood is to be established. Now, there were those who are a part of the tribe of Levi, or Levi, as you would call it, that were established as priests. But then it also goes further, and it begins to establish that there are other ways that those who are not from the tribe of Levi, who had a desire to serve Yehovah, that they would be able to go and they would be able to serve. And it talks about the Nazarite vow. Remember, we were talking, you've heard probably a lot about the Nazarite vow. So in the book of Numbers, and it begins to establish this understanding of other individuals from other tribes, not of Levi or Levi, that were interested in serving as a priesthood or serving in the temple of God, how they could prepare themselves in a place to be holy, that they would be able to serve by taking on what is called a Nazarite vow. Okay, so God's principles are made visual by means of his rituals and the wilderness tabernacle. And the wilderness tabernacle, we understand it was a huge tent that was erected, that was put up, animal skins and different things that were done. And this temple that was created, that they were moving, that was mobile, that you could set up and take down because they were mobile. This temple was actually a earthly physical model of God's heavenly throne room. And so as we look at the tabernacle, this tabernacle was an earthly physical model of what God's heavenly throne room was like. And so as we begin to go through the book of Numbers, we see that God is revealing himself through these rituals and through these laws and through these customs. After 400 years of sitting dormant, 1 year in Israel is redeemed and it saves Egypt. And I want to talk about that because that brings us to a very interesting point that we're going to have to discuss. But so it's best for us to understand by Midbar or Numbers that it is separated into three sections. And we're going to talk about these three sections really quick. All right. The first section is what we'll see in chapters 1 through 10. All right. In chapters 1 through 10, in Bamidbar, which means what? In the wilderness. We see them in the wilderness of Sinai. We see them in their camp. We see that God is establishing order in the camp. He is bringing forth, or we see the rise of Nazarites. And I told you that those Nazarites were individuals that were not a part of the tribe of Levi, that had a desire to serve and to give their lives and devotion in the temple or the tabernacle of God. And we see God in his tabernacle. We see him operating and leading, and he becomes the central focus that Israel now lives and governs their lives around this tabernacle. We see that he goes into the tabernacle. We see that Moshe is speaking with God face to face or in the presence of God. The smoke fills, and they knew that he was in the tabernacle. We see all of this stuff taking place as we begin to go through chapters 1 through 10. As we look at the second section, and I want you to get used to calling it Bamidbar. Bamidbar, that's B with an apostrophe, MID, BAR, Bamidbar. And that means in the wilderness. That is what Numbers truly means, okay? But the second section of this, and this is chapters 11 through 25, we'll begin to see the rebellious, how God deals with the rebellious people, those who were rebellious. We begin to see the narratives of the challenge. Just because he had brought them out did not mean that their challenges were over. And we begin to see how God begins to deal with Israel, and he begins to show them how to deal with these challenges. The challenge of releasing, you got to think, they're leaving Egypt. And so 12 months out, the further they got away and the further that Egypt became a part of their history, the more God reveals to them, and he begins to have this relationship with them so that he can begin to establish, draw them in, and begin to show them who he desires them to be as his people. We see the first generation of exiles, the rebellion of people, those who did not want to do as God has commanded. Then we also see, this is where we begin to see the story and the account of Joshua and Caleb, the 12 spies that are going to go in. We also see in the book of Bamidbar, we see Balaam, the pagan prophet, the story of Balaam, the pagan prophet. So there's a lot of interesting things that happen in the book of Numbers that is very interesting and very distinct to this book that is way bigger than Numbers. And then the third section of Bamidbar, or the book of Numbers, is in the plains of Moab. We begin to see Israel moving to the plains of Moab, where they're preparing for the conquest of Canaan, and understanding that these are people who have been promised a land that is flowing with milk and honey, that are going to number themselves so that they take a census, that they have spies that are going to go out, that there are false prophets or pagan prophets in the land, that there are inhabitants in this land where they are going, and they're preparing by sending this forth the spies. This now begins to give you a clear indication of where we're going. Now they're entering to the plains of Moab. They're preparing for this conquest of Canaan. Chapters 26 through 36 deal with these particular things. And then there is another census, and we'll talk about why this happened. additional battles. And then there's this establishment of cities of refuge. And I want to explain that to you. Or we call them sanctuary cities. And what would take place is I told you that before God's law was fully established, man, they covered or they governed themselves by something which was called the code or the ethic of Hammurabi. And that was basically like an eye for an eye. You know, we see you kill my dog, I kill your dog. And in cases of capital punishment or cases of murder, what was that called? Shakdam, where blood was shed outside of the two reasons, which were what? Sacrifice and atonement. They created these cities of refuge or sanctuary cities. And if someone was murdered accidentally or purposely or intentionally, the person who was accused of that crime could actually find his way to this sanctuary city, which was a city of refuge, until the judges were able to come in and take a look at what was going on and adequately determine what should take place. All right. And those judges, now we see a more organized and a formalized of governing themselves, that the book of Leviticus, or in terms of how we should govern, Numbers and Deuteronomy are also going to play in terms of how these people are to live. So sanctuary cities existed not only today, but the concept of that came from the 26th to the 36th chapters of the book of Numbers, in which Israel was now preparing to govern themselves and deal with shakadam, the issues of shed blood. Now let's begin to look at we did read. Okay, I want us to begin to look at Numbers, the first chapter. So I'm going to pull up here really quick, Numbers, the first chapter, and we're going to read through that as we get going here. All right, Numbers chapter 1. And if you guys get with me, I'm going to pull all this together, but I got to get through this. This is the beginning of a new chapter. So there's some things I got to establish so that you guys, this is what I'm looking at, my phone. So I see you guys, I can see your names on here, even when I pull my note screen. So just so you know why I'm looking to that side. Okay. All right. So I want to bring up Numbers, the first chapter, and I'm going to share my screen with you guys one more time. And I hope this is good for you. Good morning to everybody. Sorry I'm late. Everybody that's here, great morning. Great. I'm glad to have you guys here. All right, so let's get in here. I'm going to share my screen for Numbers, the first chapter. And I think that we will read some of this in the CJ Bible, the Complete Jewish Bible, and we'll also read some of this in the King James Version, if that's okay. Numbers chapter 1. I'm not sure what I did. All right, here we go. And if you have it, you're there with me. All right, cool. And it says, and I'm going to just highlight as we go. And the Lord spake unto Moshe in the wilderness of Sinai, and in the tabernacle of the congregation, on the first day of the second month. First day of the second month, okay? In the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt. So we're looking at about 13 months at this point. It's the first day of the second month of the second year, okay? And it says, take ye the sum of all the congregation of the children of Israel, after their families, by the house of their fathers, in the number of their names, every male by their polls. So we're taking a census. This is the first day of the second month of the second year. So this is 13 months out, 14 months out, and they're beginning to take the census of all of the males according to their tribes. And this is what they're doing from 20 years old and upward. So they're taking this from 20 years and upward. What's up, Rudy Barnett, Latrice Robbins? All of that are able to go forth to war in Israel, thou and Aaron, Aaron, so Moshe and Aaron, shall number them by their names. So 20 years and older is what we're taking. 20 years and older, every male by their tribe. We're taking these lists, right? And with you there shall be a man of every tribe, every one head of the house of their fathers. And these are the names of the men that shall stand with you of the tribe of Reuben. So these are the ones that we're numbering. Everyone's not going to be numbered, but we're going to number these men who are 20 years and older according to their tribe. And we're going to use these men from these specific tribe, because remember, the tribe of Levi or Levi was not to be numbered among them, because they were to be the tribe, the priestly tribe, or those that were considered for service to the God. So they were not going to go to war. And these are the names of the men that you shall take with you: of the tribe of Reuben, Eleazar, the son the son of Shadur, of Simeon, Shelmiel, the son of Zeredeshdai, of Judah, Nahshon, the son of Aminadab, of, this is like speaking in another language, of Issachar, of Nethiel, the son of Zior, of Zebulun. They go through all of these names, right? These are the tribes. These are the men of Dan, of Benjamin, of Abinadab, of Asher, of Gad, of Naphtali, of a particular family, Ahir, the son of Elon. So a particular tribe of a particular group of men. This is what they're doing. So men that are 20 years and older, of a particular tribe, Benjamin, of Dan, of Asher, but then of a particular group or a lineage in that tribe. Pagil, the son of Akron, uh, Eliasaph, the son of Dual. And in verse number 16, these were the renowned of the congregation, princes of the tribes of their fathers, heads of thousands in Israel. And Moshe or Moses and Aaron or Aaron took these men, which are expressed by their names, and they assembled all the congregation together on the first day. Listen to this. And they assembled all the congregation together on the first day of the second month. They declared their pedigrees after their families by the house of their fathers, according to the number of names, from 20 years old and upward, by their polls or their census. As the Lord commanded Moses, so he numbered them in the wilderness of Sinai. And the children of Reuben, Israel's eldest son, by their generations after their families, by the house of their fathers, according to the number of names, by their polls or census, every male from 20 years old and upward, all that were able to go forth to war. Okay, so as we begin to look at this, it becomes very clear. This was not just a census. Israel has now become, they're free, they're wandering, they're Bamidbar, they're in the wilderness. And in the book of Numbers, we now begin to see, and we saw that in the 21st verse, what was the reason? They weren't just taking a number to number themselves so that they could just number themselves, but they were actually taking a census, a number. How many men 20 years and older? Every nation that we see, even today, I think it's 18 years old. When you turn 18 in the United States, you're old enough to go to war. You're old enough to go to war, but you're not old enough. Anyway, so you're old enough at 18 to go to war. I'm gonna get off that soapbox. You're old enough to go to war at 18, and that is the age. And so here in the book of Numbers, God establishes the number at 20 years old. So every male that is 20 years old from every single tribe, from a particular lineage of people, those who were renowned. That means these were the outstanding men, probably the men that were the strongest or the most wise or had some type of tool, were all to be numbered according to tribe. And they were doing this for the purpose of establishing how many men do we have that are available to go into war. Now, keep in mind, this entire understanding of the book of Numbers is important, because it is establishing we are now we are getting the law, we are getting ourselves aligned. So after he brought them out, he gave them the law, his way of covenant, so that they could begin to be a reflection of who he is and understand who he was. He is now giving them a military, a national military. Why? Because it was important for them to number the men that were able to fight, so that as they went into war, they could go into the battle. They would already have a number of how many men went into battle, so that after the battle, they would be able to know how many men they lost during the course of the battle. And so when we begin to see the book of Numbers, that's why I told you the book of Numbers is really a fascinating book, even though it sounds like you're accounting. The book of Numbers shows us how God begins, because there's going to be a second census. So after you have a battle, you take a second census to find out how many men died in that battle. And so Numbers is really about God preparing the children of Israel to go into the battle, to go into the war, to conquer the land. And so when we begin to look at this, it's important to keep that in context, because you get a better understanding. So ritual is in the book of Numbers, as we begin. Sorry, good to see you, Terry. when we begin to look at the concept of ritual, we hate rituals. People today, we hate rituals. There are very few rituals that we extend to. People want to say the rituals are outdated, but what rituals do is they show you the character and the content of who God is. And so it's important for us to understand that, because even today, we do what, communion, we do feet washing every now and then, and we do baptism. So we struggle with keeping or identifying or understanding the importance of rituals in the Torah, which are the books of law, because in the Torah, the books of law, or these rituals, help us to have an understanding of who God is. And without these rituals, it's impossible to know who Jehovah is, right? So the step one of what God was doing, and this is all important background work for Israel. I mean, for us to understand the book of Numbers. The first step that God had to do was he had to remove Israel from Egypt. And the further they got away from Egypt, and Egypt was in the back, the rear view mirror of where they were going, God could then begin to explain to him and express to them who he was. Many people wanted to go back, but he had to show them that there's something that is greater for you to go towards. All right. So that's why so many people died in the wilderness, because they were not accepting the fact that God had delivered them. And we'll talk about that. The second step is the Lord then began to teach Israel about his holiness. And through these laws and through the Torah, he begins to tell us about God, what he loves, who he is, what he values, what he abhors. All of those things we begin to see now as he begins to give us the Torah, especially in the book of Leviticus. We begin to see how God operates, what he loves, what he desires, what God expects, what is God's definition of what holiness is, and that is revealed through his Torah. Now, there are some patterns here, and we're going to conclude right here, that are very important for us to understand. Remember, I told you that when you look at the Bible and you study the Bible, if you really want to get the true essence of the Bible, you don't do so by talking about facts or points. That you talk about the patterns that God establishes. And we're going to see this. I'm going to continually talk to you throughout the entire Bible about the patterns that we are seeing. And these patterns continually remain the same. All right. So I need you all, I'm going to throw some of y'all theology off. I said this a million times, but I'm going to say it again. Israel was not redeemed by knowledge. They were not redeemed by the Torah. The law of that God is giving us did not redeem Israel. God redeemed Israel. They were not redeemed by knowledge or an account of the law or the Bible or any. That is not what they were redeemed by. A move of God. They were redeemed by an act of God. All right. So once we begin to understand that God redeemed Israel when he brought them out of Egypt. Remember, and when we look at this, and I told you all this before, so Israel was not redeemed by the law. They were redeemed by a move or an act of God. And that act of God was when he brought them out of Egypt, redemption or salvation. And we can use these words on a general preface in a very similar fashion. Redemption, salvation, they're interchangeable to some degree in this point in terms of a general understanding. So the law did not redeem Israel. And I told you all this before, the law did not save Israel. God saved Israel when he removed them from Egypt and he brought them in through the wilderness. And we begin to see this pattern existing. So once the Spirit has been indwelled in us, and this is for Christians, now we're ready for knowledge. So God removed them, and then once he removed them from Egypt, what did he do? That was the first step. The second step was he gave them his Torah. He gave them Leviticus and Deuteronomy and Numbers, so that we could begin to understand and begin to get knowledge of who he was. See, we often say that we've got to seek knowledge, we've got to seek an understanding, and we give this understanding like it's going to come mysteriously, but the word of God tells us over and over again that the law of God, the word of God, the Bible is not for the unbeliever. It's for those who believe. So he gives us, he redeems us, and then he gives us an understanding through his word. All right. So you don't get an understanding of God, then you say, okay, now, yeah, I understand enough. So now I want to become a child of God. No, you are redeemed. And then through your relationship in the New Testament, he gives us his spirit. We then now have the ability to understand who he is. We cannot intellectualize ourselves into a relationship with Christ, but the relationship comes first and then the understanding. All right. So it's important for us to understand that. And so as we begin to do this, we talk about this concept. And in the book of Numbers, we now begin to see the name Jesus. And so many of you, and we're going to talk just real quick, and I'm going to close right out here. We talk about, I often refer to him as Yeshua, the Messiah, and that is Jesus the Messiah. And when we talk about this, I need you guys to understand that there is nothing wrong with you all saying the word Jesus. There's nothing wrong with you saying the name Jesus. It is really a transliteration because in actuality, the name Jesus and the name Joshua that we find Moses' contemporary are actually the same thing. And if we were to pronounce Joshua's name as it originally was, it would be Yehoshua, right? And then just, you know how you say Michael, and then you may abbreviate it to Mike. Michael becomes Mike, but it's the same person. So Yehoshua, it was translated to Yeshua, Yahashua to Yeshua, and then the transliteration of that name becomes Jesus when you go to the English language. So when you say the word Jesus, yes, that is Jesus's name. It is not the pronunciation because you're speaking a different language. That makes sense, right? So we begin to hear the name Jesus used as the Bible goes, because Yeshua is actually a German. When Martin Luther did his translation of the Bible, and we got it. That's how we ended up with Yeshua. Okay. And then Jesus is the English translation of that word. So I want to make sure that we're understanding these basic Bible principles so that as we get into this conversation in the book of Numbers, we begin to see that. Now, one of the things that was important, and this is it, in the book, you notice it said that this was the first day of the second month of the second year. So about 13 months in, we now have the book of Numbers. This is 13 years. All of this changed in 13 years. This is crazy. I mean, in 13 months, 1 year. And so it's important to understand that first of all, that God redeemed or saved Israel with the Passover or the Pesach. He then gave them its law so that he could begin to express who he was. And most of us think that the 613 laws of the Torah are all about us. It's about, thou shalt not, you have to do this, you have to do this. But the reality is that those 613 laws of the Torah are really about God, us showing the character of God. All right, remember, Israel was not redeemed by their knowledge of God. They were redeemed by a work of God. And that work of God was him bringing him out during the Passover. And then he gave them the law. So the law does not bring redemption. The law brings a fulfillment of an understanding of God so that we can understand who he is. Now, the first day of the second month of the year, every single the first of every month was considered a holiday in Hebrew culture. It was called Ruach HaKodesh. All right. Well, excuse me. Ruach HaKodesh is the word for Holy Spirit. But the first day of every month was considered a holiday. And that holiday, what was the name of that holiday? Oh, Hebrew. It was called Rosh Hadesh. Rosh Hadesh at the beginning of every month was considered a holiday. Rosh Hadesh, Hebrew Rosh Hadesh, is basically the new moon. And so the first day of every month was considered a holiday. So it was during this Rosh Hashanah that they would come in and all of the leaders of Israel would come together. And this is when the census took place, so that you understand that. The census took place on the first day of the second month of the second year, the 13th month, right? And so we begin to see this is why the census took place. They would come together as tribes, the leaders, they would put together things that were important, and then they would disperse that information. So they came together, gave the rules for this census. Those leaders went out, numbered their people, came back together, and then they began to prepare for battle. Numbers is a book that prepares for the book of Joshua for us to go forward. But you had to know how many people that you were going into battle with so that after the war, you knew what your casualties were. This is my foundation principle. It's a little bit longer than normal, but hopefully it helps you to understand as we go into the book of Numbers so that you have a clear understanding of what God's word is saying. It is not a mystery. It is clearly understood, and it is clearly defined by his word. So I hope you guys are being blessed on today. Take care of yourselves and each other. God bless you. Grace and peace.